The room seemed to hold its breath for a long moment, as though the assembled company could not quite accept what the doctor had just declared. Mrs. Caldwell's hand remained on Mr. Pemberton's arm, her fingers still and pale against the dark wool of his jacket. Her face, always composed, had taken on the waxy appearance of porcelain, and her lips had compressed into a thin line. Around the room, the other guests stood or sat in various attitudes of shock and disbelief. Patricia, the doctor's wife, had covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide above her fingers. The vicar's wife was murmuring a prayer beneath her breath. The farmer named Crowley had turned away toward the window, his broad shoulders tense. Miss Marple, however, remained seated, her knitting still resting on her lap, her expression one of quiet contemplation. Her pale blue eyes moved from the body of Mr. Seckel Pemberton to the untouched mince pie still sitting on the small plate beside her, and then to the remaining pies on their platters. She did not speak, but her fingers had gone still, the needles no longer clicking. The doctor, whose name was Richard Ashford, was a man of some 45 years, with the manner of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He straightened from his examination of the body and spoke with the authority of his position. "Someone must telephone for the police at once," he announced. "This is not a natural death. I am quite certain of it." His gaze swept around the room, and it came to rest momentarily on the platters of mince pies. "No one is to touch anything. Do you understand? Nothing is to be moved or disturbed. This is now a matter for the authorities." Mrs. Caldwell appeared to gather herself, though she remained deathly pale. She turned toward her housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Bennet, who had been hovering near the doorway with an expression of blank horror. "Mrs. Bennet," Mrs. Caldwell said, her voice steady but barely above a whisper, "please telephone the police immediately. Tell them there has been an incident, a death. Then inform the doctor that we require his services." Mrs. Bennet hurried from the room without a word, her sensible shoes clicking rapidly against the parquet flooring. In her absence, an uncomfortable silence descended upon the gathering, broken only by the occasional suppressed sob or nervous clearing of the throat. The solicitor, Whitmore, had sat back down heavily in his chair, his face flushed. He was still holding his own mince pie, though he had clearly abandoned any intention of eating it. He stared at it as though it had become something distasteful, and presently he set the plate down on a side table with deliberate care. The vicar, a man named Thornton, who possessed all the virtues and weaknesses typical of his profession, was attempting to offer what comfort he could, moving from guest to guest with murmured words of reassurance. "Surely it was merely a seizure," he was heard to say to one of the farmers. The poor man had a weak heart, did he not? I recall Mrs. Pemberton mentioning it some years ago. But even as he spoke, his eyes drifted back to the body slumped in the chair and to the broken mince pie scattered across the carpet. No one, it seemed, was quite willing to accept the vicar's hopeful interpretation of events. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, and with it came a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Mrs. Caldwell moved to the sideboard and poured herself a small glass of sherry with hands that trembled only slightly. She did not offer drinks to the others, and no one asked for one. Instead, the guests remained where they were, trapped in the peculiar paralysis that follows upon sudden death. Miss Marple rose from her chair with the careful deliberation of advanced age, setting her knitting aside on the cushioned seat. She approached the nearest platter of mince pies and examined them with an expression of mild interest, her head tilted slightly to one side. She did not touch them, but her eyes moved from pie to pie, as though she were counting them or perhaps comparing them for some subtle difference. The doctor observed her action and moved quickly to her side. "Miss Marple, I really must insist that you do not disturb anything," he said, his tone not unkind but firm. Miss Marple glanced up at him with a gentle smile. "Oh, I am not disturbing anything, dear doctor." she replied in her soft, quavering voice. "I was merely observing. It has always seemed to me that the details of things are rather important, do you not think? One notices so much if one simply takes the time to look." She turned away from the pies and made her way back to her chair, settling into it with a soft sigh. The doctor remained for a moment, looking after her with an expression of mild puzzlement before returning his attention to the body of Mr. Pemberton. Within the hour, the police had arrived. Inspector Graves was a man of some 60 years, with grey hair and the weathered features of someone who had spent his life investigating human failings. He moved through the drawing room with the methodical efficiency of long experience, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. The position of the body, the scattered pie, the platters of untouched pies, the faces of the assembled guests. He began by speaking with the doctor, confirming the circumstances of Mr. Pemberton's death. Then, turning to address the gathering as a whole, he announced that no one was to leave Thornfield Hall until he had taken statements from each person present. A collective shudder seemed to pass through the group at this pronouncement. The comfortable, civilized world they inhabited had been disrupted in the most shocking manner possible, and it was now clear to everyone that one of them, one of their own, might be a murderer. Inspector Graves established himself in Mrs. Caldwell's study, a room lined with leather-bound books and dominated by a mahogany desk of considerable age and dignity. The study was located at some distance from the drawing room, which afforded a degree of privacy for the questioning that was to follow. He had brought with him a sergeant, a young man named Collins, who possessed the unfortunate habit of writing down everything with the earnestness of someone for whom the act of documentation was a moral imperative. One by one, the guests were summoned from the drawing room, their expressions ranging from nervous apprehension to barely concealed indignation at the implication that any of them might be involved in criminal conduct. The first to be questioned was the doctor himself, who provided a clear account of Mr. Pemberton's symptoms and confirmed that death had almost certainly been caused by poisoning of some kind. The convulsions, the discoloration of the lips, the rapidity of the collapse, these are all consistent with the ingestion of a toxic substance, Dr. Ashford explained, his professional manner lending weight to his words. Inspector Graves listened carefully, making notes of his own, and then asked the crucial question. "In your professional opinion, Doctor, could such a substance have been present in the food?" Dr. Ashford hesitated for only a moment. "It is certainly possible," he admitted. "The mince pie he was eating is the most likely vector. The spices and dried fruit would mask the taste of many poisons quite effectively." The inspector's eyes narrowed at this observation, and he made a note of particular significance. When the solicitor, Mr. Whitmore, was brought in, he was visibly agitated, his face flushed with either anger or fear. It was difficult to say which. "This is an outrage," he declared before the inspector had even begun his questioning. "Surely you cannot suspect any of us. We are all people of standing, of reputation. The man must have had a heart condition. It is the only reasonable explanation." Inspector Graves regarded him with the patient expression of someone accustomed to the protests of the guilty and the innocent alike. "Mr. Whitmore, I am simply gathering information at this stage. Tell me, when did you last see Mr. Pemberton alive?" Whitmore's flush deepened. "At the tea table, naturally. We all saw him then. He was perfectly well until he ate that cursed pie." "And you ate one of the pies yourself, I understand." "I did. Yes, but yet you are unharmed." Whitmore opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, seeming to realize the implication of the inspector's words. If someone poisoned a pie, Inspector Graves continued calmly, it would have to be someone who knew which pie Mr. Pemberton would receive, or perhaps someone who poisoned all of them, taking the risk that they themselves might eat one. At this, Whitmore's already pale complexion became even more ashen. He was dismissed shortly thereafter, and the next guest was summoned. The vicar's wife, Margaret Thornton, was considerably more composed than her husband would have been in her position. She provided a steady account of the afternoon, offering no elaboration beyond what was necessary, but also no attempt at evasion. Yes, she had eaten a mince pie. No, she had noticed nothing unusual about it. Had she observed Mr. Pemberton closely during the meal? Not particularly, though she had seen him collapse. Inspector Graves seemed satisfied with her responses, and she was excused. As the afternoon wore on and the light outside the study windows faded to a deep grey, a pattern of sorts began to emerge from the statements, though whether it was a pattern of guilt or merely coincidence was impossible to determine. Nearly everyone present had eaten one of the mince pies. Several had not. Of those who had eaten them, all reported that the pies were delicious and showed no signs of contamination. The doctor's second wife, Patricia, had seemed genuinely distressed by the questioning, though whether her distress was appropriate to the circumstances or excessive was a matter of interpretation. She had also eaten a pie, she confirmed, and had felt perfectly well afterward. Then, as the evening settled over Ashford-in-the-Water, Inspector Graves called Miss Marple into the study. She entered with her usual unhurried manner, accepting the chair that the inspector offered her with a polite incline of her head. She arranged her black skirts around her with meticulous care before settling herself comfortably. Inspector Graves, who had been conducting his interviews with the brusque efficiency typical of his profession, found himself somewhat disconcerted by Miss Marple's evident tranquillity. She sat regarding him with her pale blue eyes, the faintest suggestion of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth, as though she were mildly amused by something he had not yet perceived. "Miss Marple," he began, consulting his notes, "you were present at the tea this afternoon?" "Yes, Inspector. I have attended Mrs. Caldwell's Christmas gathering for many years. It is always a most pleasant occasion. And you observed Mr. Pemberton's collapse?" "I did, yes. Most distressing." "Did you notice anything unusual about him before the incident? His behaviour? His manner?" Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Well, Inspector, I found it rather interesting that he seemed to take a second look at his mince pie before beginning to eat it, as though something about it had caught his attention. But whether that was significant or merely a momentary inclination to admire the pastry work, I could not say. Inspector Graves made a note of this observation. "And you yourself were offered a pie, Miss Marple?" "I was, yes. Mrs. Caldwell was most attentive to my comfort." "Yet you did not eat it?" Miss Marple glanced down at her hands, which were folded in her lap with characteristic composure. "No, Inspector. I have always found that at my age the anticipation of a thing is often more satisfying than the consumption of it. The prospect of enjoying it later seemed preferable to the certainty of indigestion in the present moment." The inspector seemed to find this explanation satisfactory, though not particularly illuminating. As Miss Marple rose to leave, she paused at the door of the study. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I wonder if you might give some thought to the question of motive. In my experience, murder is rarely committed without reason. Whatever poison was used, and however it was administered, the question that matters most is not how, but why. And to understand why, one must understand the hearts and histories of the people involved." Inspector Graves remained in his chair for a long moment after Miss Marple had departed, her words echoing in the quiet study. He was accustomed to receiving advice from the relatives and acquaintances of victims, most of it unhelpful and born more from a desire to appear useful than from genuine insight. Yet there had been something in Miss Marple's manner, a quality of thoughtfulness that suggested she had offered her observation not from vanity, but from genuine consideration. He made a note of her words and then turned his attention to the matter at hand. By the time the evening had fully settled over Thornfield Hall, Inspector Graves had completed his initial interviews with all the guests. He had released them to the various bedrooms that Mrs. Caldwell, with admirable presence of mind, had offered them for the night. The village constable had been instructed to post himself in the hallway to ensure that no one attempted to leave before morning. The body of Mr. Pemberton had been removed to the village mortuary, where the doctor would perform a preliminary examination to determine the nature of the poison that had claimed his life. Inspector Graves had also made arrangements for the mince pies to be analysed by a chemist in the neighbouring market town. Though he suspected that such analysis would confirm what was already becoming apparent, that one or more of the pies contained a lethal substance. It was only as the inspector was preparing to retire for the night that he received a summons from Mrs. Caldwell herself. She was waiting for him in her private sitting room, a smaller and more intimate space than the drawing room, furnished with comfortable chairs and decorated with watercolours of alpine landscapes. She looked considerably diminished from her earlier composure, her face drawn, and her hands trembling slightly as she poured tea from a silver pot. "Inspector," she began without preamble, "I must tell you something that may be of importance to your investigation. It is a matter of some delicacy, and I have hesitated to speak of it, but I believe that the truth must now be known." Graves settled himself in the chair opposite her and waited, his expression encouraging. "Mr. Pemberton was not the man he appeared to be," Mrs. Caldwell continued, her voice low and measured. "To the world, he was a retired schoolmaster of unblemished reputation, a man respected in this village for more than 30 years. But there were aspects of his character that few people knew." She paused, gathering her courage. "Some years ago, when my husband was still alive, there was an incident at the school. A young girl, she must have been no more than 14 at the time, made certain allegations against Mr. Pemberton. My husband, who was magistrate at the time, was called upon to investigate the matter. The girl eventually recanted her story, claiming that she had been mistaken and that she harboured no ill will toward Mr. Pemberton. The matter was closed and the incident was largely forgotten. But you did not forget," Inspector Graves observed quietly. Mrs. Caldwell shook her head. "No, Inspector, I did not. My husband always believed that the girl had been pressured into recanting her accusation. He never said as much explicitly, but I knew him well enough to read his doubts. And there were other incidents over the years, nothing concrete, nothing that could be proven, but whispers and concerns that circulated among those of us who pay attention to such things." The inspector made careful notes of this revelation. "Do you know the name of the girl who made the original allegation?" "Her name was Margaret Ashford," Mrs. Caldwell replied. "She was the daughter of the previous doctor in the village. She is no longer here. She left Ashford in the water some 15 years ago and married a man from Surrey. But her family remains, and I believe her brother still lives in the village." Inspector Graves felt a sudden sharpness in his attention. "Her brother, Mrs. Caldwell? What is his name?" "Dr. Richard Ashford," Mrs. Caldwell replied. "He returned to the village some 8 years ago to take over the village practice after the previous doctor retired. He may not even remember the incident clearly. He was away at medical school when it occurred, but his sister's family connections to the village are a matter of record." The inspector closed his notebook slowly, and his expression had become thoughtful. The threads of the case were beginning to weave themselves into a pattern, however preliminary and incomplete. After Mrs. Caldwell had been dismissed to her rest, Inspector Graves sat alone in the study, considering the implications of what he had learned. If Dr. Ashford harboured resentment toward Mr. Pemberton for the alleged harm done to his sister, he would certainly have had the means to poison the mince pies. He had been present at the tea, and as a doctor, he would know precisely which poisons would be most effective and least detectable. Yet there was a difficulty in this theory. The doctor himself had eaten one of the pies and remained unharmed, unless, of course, he had somehow ensured that his own pie was safe while poisoning another. It was possible, but it seemed unnecessarily complicated. The inspector rose from his chair and moved to the window, looking out into the darkness that had fallen over the village. Somewhere in Thornfield Hall, the murderer was sleeping, perhaps peacefully, perhaps tormented by conscience. By morning, Inspector Graves was determined he would begin the more rigorous work of investigation. He would speak again with each of the suspects, probing more deeply into their relationships with the deceased. He would examine the circumstances of the mince pie's preparation with meticulous care. And he would pay particular attention to Dr. Richard Ashford, a man who had access to poisons and who possessed a potential motive that few in the village would have guessed at. Yet as he stood at the window, the inspector found himself thinking of Miss Marple's words. To understand why, one must understand the hearts and histories of the people involved. It was a sentiment with which he found himself in unexpected agreement. The morning came grey and cold, with a thin mist clinging to the grounds of Thornfield Hall like a shroud. Inspector Graves rose early, having slept poorly, and found the village already stirring with the kind of feverish activity that attends upon sudden death in a small community. Word of Mr. Pemberton's demise had spread through Ashford in the Water with the inexorable speed of gossip, and the village was alive with speculation and rumour. The baker's wife had encountered the vicar's housekeeper at the market, and from that single conversation had sprouted a dozen different theories about what might have occurred. By midday, it was widely believed that Miss Pemberton had been murdered by a jilted lover, or alternatively by a disgruntled former student seeking revenge for some long-ago slight. The more imaginative among the village's residents had even suggested that the poisoning might be the work of foreign agents, though no coherent explanation for this theory was ever offered. Inspector Graves was well aware of the tendency for such speculation to obscure rather than illuminate the facts of a case. He had therefore instructed that the guests of Thornfield Hall were to remain in the house until his investigation had reached a preliminary conclusion. Mrs. Caldwell had accepted this necessity with the grace of someone accustomed to accepting disagreeable circumstances, though Graves could perceive the strain that the situation was beginning to impose upon her. She moved through the halls of her own home with the air of a woman in her own private purgatory, her earlier composure fractured by the knowledge that one of her guests, one of the people she had invited into her home, had almost certainly perpetrated an act of violence within its walls. The inspector's second day of investigation began with a careful examination of the kitchen, where Mrs. Caldwell's cook, a woman named Eleanor, provided a detailed account of the preparation of the mince pies. She had begun her work at 7 o'clock that morning, she explained, having prepared the filling the previous day according to Mrs. Caldwell's exacting specifications. The filling itself was kept locked in a cupboard, and only Mrs. Caldwell possessed the key. Eleanor had prepared the pastry from scratch, using butter, flour, and salt. The pies had been assembled by Mrs. Caldwell herself, a task she performed with meticulous care, placing exactly the same amount of filling in each pie. They had been baked in the oven for precisely 18 minutes, at a temperature of 420 degrees, and at no point Inspector Graves asked, "Did you leave the kitchen unattended?" Eleanor shook her head firmly. "No, sir. I was here the entire time." Mrs. Caldwell came down at 8:30 to check on the progress, and again at 9 to remove them from the oven. After that, she left them to cool and returned to her sitting room. I remained here in the kitchen, tidying up and preparing the other items for the tea. And no one else came into the kitchen during this time? Only Mrs. Bennet, bringing fresh water for the kettle, and the gardener's boy, collecting vegetables for the evening meal. But neither of them came anywhere near the pies, sir. I would have noticed. The inspector made careful notes of this information. It appeared that the poisoning could not have taken place in the kitchen. The pies had been prepared under conditions too controlled to allow for such interference, which meant that the poison must have been introduced after the pies had left the kitchen and after they had been arranged on the platters. This narrowed the field of suspects considerably though it did not eliminate anyone who had been present at Thornfield Hall in the hours preceding the tea. Inspector Graves's next interview was with Dr. Ashford, whom he called to the study with deliberate formality. The doctor arrived with an expression of barely concealed irritation, his bearing suggesting a man unaccustomed to being questioned as though he were a common suspect. "Inspector," he said, settling himself in the chair with visible stiffness, "I trust this will not take long. I have patients in the village who require my attention, and my presence here is becoming a considerable inconvenience." Graves regarded him with an expression of polite interest. "I understand your concerns, Doctor. However, this is a matter of some importance. I have learned something of your family history that I believe may be relevant to the investigation. Specifically, I have been informed that your sister, Margaret Ashford, made allegations against Mr. Pemberton some 15 years ago." The doctor's face went very still. A muscle worked at the corner of his jaw, and his hands, which had been resting on the arms of his chair, suddenly gripped them tightly. "That is ancient history, Inspector," he said, his voice tight, "and it is a matter that I have no wish to discuss. Nevertheless, Doctor, I must insist. Your sister made allegations of impropriety against Mr. Pemberton. She later recanted those allegations. I find myself curious as to why." Dr. Ashford rose abruptly from his chair. "My sister is not a subject for police interrogation, Inspector. Whatever occurred in the past, it is not relevant to the question of Mr. Pemberton's death. If you have further questions, I suggest you ask my solicitor." He turned toward the door, but Graves's voice stopped him before he could reach it. "Doctor, I have verified your account of eating a mince pie at the tea. I have also verified that you remained in the drawing room throughout the afternoon and showed no signs of ill effects from consuming the pie. This is, in fact, consistent with innocence on your part. However, your knowledge of poisons, combined with your potential motive, makes you a person of considerable interest in this investigation. I would advise you to reconsider your refusal to cooperate." Dr. Ashford paused at the door, his shoulders rigid. For a long moment he did not speak. Then, slowly, he returned to his chair and sat down. "My sister," he said quietly, "was a sensitive girl. Mr. Pemberton was her schoolmaster when she was 14 years old. She came to me in tears one evening, claiming that he had touched her inappropriately and made suggestions of a nature that I will not elaborate upon. I was away at university at the time, but I urged her to report the matter to our parents and to the authorities. She eventually did so, but by then Mr. Pemberton had apparently convinced her that no one would believe her, that she would be made out to be a liar and a troublemaker. When questioned by my father and the magistrate, she recanted her story. Whether she was coerced into this recantation or whether she simply lost her nerve, I have never been entirely certain. What I do know is that Margaret left Ashford in the water as soon as she was old enough, and she has not spoken of the incident since. But I have never forgotten it, and I have never forgiven Mr. Pemberton for whatever he may have done to her." The inspector listened carefully to this account, watching the doctor's face as he spoke. There was genuine pain there, genuine anger. Yet there was also something else, a kind of resignation, as though the doctor had long ago accepted that justice would never be served in this particular matter. "Thank you for your candor, Doctor," Graves said when the account was finished. "That will be all for now." After Dr. Ashford had been dismissed, Inspector Graves sat alone in the study with his thoughts and his notes. The case, which had initially seemed comparatively straightforward, a poisoning at a tea party, a limited number of suspects, a clear opportunity for the crime, was beginning to reveal itself as considerably more complex. The doctor possessed both motive and means, yet something about the affair did not sit comfortably with the inspector's experience. A man does not typically murder someone after 15 years of inaction, particularly not in such a public and elaborate manner. Revenge, when it comes, usually arrives swiftly, born from passion rather than patience. Yet Dr. Ashford's anger, while evident, had the quality of old scar tissue, painful when touched, but long since healed into acceptance. The inspector was therefore inclined to believe that the doctor, despite his clear resentment of Mr. Pemberton, was not the perpetrator of the crime. This conclusion, however, left him with a room full of other suspects, each with their own secrets and grievances, none of which were immediately apparent. It was at this juncture that Miss Marple requested an audience with the inspector. She arrived in the study dressed as she had been the previous day, her black cardigan and sensible shoes giving her the appearance of someone who had merely stepped out of her sitting room rather than undertaken a formal interview. She carried with her, somewhat incongruously, a small notebook bound in dark leather, the kind one might use to record recipes or household accounts. "Inspector," she began, settling herself in the chair with deliberate care, "I have taken the liberty of making certain observations during my time here at Thornfield Hall. I thought perhaps they might be of interest to you, though I freely admit that I am merely an old woman with perhaps too much time on her hands for such ruminations." Graves, who had initially been inclined to dismiss Miss Marple's earlier remarks as the well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful observations of an elderly amateur, found himself leaning forward with genuine interest. "Please, Miss Marple, your observations would be most welcome." She opened her small notebook and adjusted her spectacles, which hung from a beaded chain around her neck. "I have been thinking," she said, "about the nature of the mince pies themselves. It is a curious thing, you see, that Mrs. Caldwell's mince pies are famous throughout the village. Everyone knows of them, everyone speaks of them, and everyone anticipates the opportunity to eat them. This is quite remarkable, really, when one considers how many other foods one might eat." "Why these particular pies?" The inspector waited, sensing that Miss Marple was building toward a point of some significance. "The reason," she continued, "is that Mrs. Caldwell guards her recipe with extraordinary jealousy. No one knows what the pies contain beyond the obvious ingredients. This has made them into something rather more than mere food. They have become a symbol of Mrs. Caldwell's exclusivity, her superiority, her position in the village. Everyone wants to know the secret, and no one can discover it." She paused, allowing this observation to settle. "Now, I have been wondering, Inspector, whether this obsession with the pies might itself be significant. What if the poisoning of the pies was not merely a matter of convenience, but a deliberate choice born from a particular emotion?" "What emotion would that be, Miss Marple?" Graves asked carefully. "Resentment," Miss Marple replied. "Resentment of Mrs. Caldwell herself. You see, Inspector, when one poisons a person at someone else's table, one does more than kill that person. One destroys the reputation and peace of the host. One transforms an event meant to bring joy and community into something tainted and terrible. One makes it impossible for that host to ever again feel safe in their own home." The inspector felt a sudden shift in his understanding of the case. The poisoning was not merely an attack on Mr. Pemberton. It was an attack on Mrs. Caldwell. "Have you any particular person in mind?" he asked. Miss Marple closed her notebook and folded her hands in her lap. "I should not like to make accusations without more certain knowledge, Inspector, but I would suggest that you might give some thought to those who have reason to harbour resentment toward Mrs. Caldwell. Who might feel themselves excluded from her circle, overlooked or dismissed? Who might see in Mrs. Caldwell's famous pies an embodiment of everything they themselves lack: position, respect, security?" She rose from her chair with the careful deliberation that seemed to characterize all her movements. "I have also noticed, Inspector, that there was a young woman present at the tea, the doctor's second wife, Patricia. She is considerably younger than the other guests, considerably less established in village society. She sat rather apart from the others, did she not? And I observed that when the pies were distributed, she took one with an eagerness that seemed to exceed the ordinary appreciation of a pleasant food, as though she were claiming something that had previously been denied her. After Miss Marple had taken her leave, The inspector sat in contemplative silence. The observation about Patricia Ashford seemed to strike a chord that had previously remained unheard in his investigation. He had, in his preliminary interviews, paid little attention to the doctor's wife, viewing her primarily as an accessory to her husband's life, rather than as a person of independent interest. Yet what if she had possessed her own motives, her own resentments? The inspector rose from his chair and made his way to the drawing room, where the guests were gathered in various states of discomfort. Patricia was seated near the window, working on a piece of needlework with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the task. When the inspector requested her presence in the study, she followed him with visible reluctance, her hands trembling slightly as she seated herself in the chair. "Mrs. Ashford," the inspector began, "I should like to ask you some questions about your relationship with Mrs. Caldwell." Patricia's needle stilled in her hands. A flush crept up her neck toward her face. "I don't know what you mean, Inspector," she said, but her voice betrayed her. Inspector Graves leaned back in his chair, regarding Patricia Ashford with an expression of patient understanding. "Mrs. Ashford, I have been conducting this investigation for nearly 2 days now, and I have learned a great deal about the people who were present at Mrs. Caldwell's tea. What I have discovered is that beneath the surface of this quiet village there exist currents of emotion and resentment that most people prefer not to acknowledge. I suspect that you, more than most, understand these currents." Patricia's hands trembled more noticeably now, and she set down her needlework with deliberate care, as though it required all her concentration to perform even this simple action. "My husband and I have only been married for 2 years, she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the folds of her skirt. "We met in London, where I was working as a secretary in a medical office. He was recently widowed, grieving, and I provided what comfort I could. When he decided to return to his native village to take over the medical practice, I was willing to follow him. I thought that perhaps I might find acceptance here, that I might build a life among people who had known him for so long." She paused, and when she continued, her voice had taken on a bitter edge. "But I was not accepted, Inspector. I was tolerated, perhaps, but never truly accepted. Mrs. Caldwell, in particular, seemed to regard me with a kind of cold disapproval. At social gatherings, she would speak to the other ladies with warmth and genuine interest, but when she addressed me, her manner became formal and distant. When I attempted to contribute to conversations, my remarks were met with polite silence or gentle correction. It became clear to me quite quickly that I was considered an outsider, an interloper, a woman who had married beneath her station in some indefinable way. The inspector listened carefully, making notes. "And this treatment was peculiar to Mrs. Caldwell, or did you experience similar coldness from others in the village?" Mrs. Caldwell set the tone, Patricia replied, and others followed her lead. "She is a person of considerable influence in this community. Her approval or disapproval carries weight. Once she had made it clear that I was not to be regarded as an equal member of village society, others naturally adopted the same attitude. It was not malicious, exactly, but it was effective. I was made to feel that no matter what I did or how well-intentioned my actions might be, I would never truly belong here." She looked up at the inspector, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Do you understand what it is like, Inspector, to be excluded? To be constantly reminded that you are different, that you do not belong, that you are fundamentally unacceptable to people around you? I had left London to escape a life of loneliness, hoping that marriage and a new home would bring me happiness. Instead, I found myself even more isolated than before. Mrs. Ashford," the inspector said carefully, "did you poison the mince pie that Mr. Pemberton ate?" Patricia's head snapped up at the question, and for a moment she seemed almost to laugh. "No, Inspector, I did not. Though I confess that I have wondered what it would be like to see Mrs. Caldwell humiliated, to see her precious certainties shattered, to see her experience even a fraction of the humiliation that she has caused me. But I did not act on those thoughts. I am not a murderer." The inspector studied her face carefully. He had conducted enough interrogations to recognize the difference between someone who was lying and someone who was telling the truth, however reluctant that truth might be. Patricia's resentment was genuine, her feelings of exclusion real, but her denial of involvement in the poisoning carried the weight of sincerity. "Thank you for your honesty, Mrs. Ashford," he said finally. "You may return to the drawing-room." After she had left, the inspector remained seated in the study, turning the matter over in his mind. Miss Marple's observation about resentment toward Mrs. Caldwell had been acute, but perhaps not in the direction he had assumed. If Patricia Ashford felt excluded and resentful, how many others in the village might harbour similar feelings? Mrs. Caldwell was a woman of considerable social power, the widow of a magistrate, the keeper of village traditions and social norms. She decided who was acceptable and who was not, whose contributions to community life were valued and whose were dismissed. What if her victim in this case was not the one who had died, but the woman whose reputation and peace of mind had been destroyed by association with the crime? The inspector rose and made his way to the drawing-room once more. This time, he requested the presence of the solicitor, Mr. Whitmore, who had been among the most vehemently defensive of the guests during his initial interview. Whitmore arrived in the study with barely concealed irritation, his portly frame settling into the chair with a groan of protest. "Inspector, I really must protest this continued questioning," he began. But Graves raised a hand to forestall further complaint. "Mr. Whitmore, I have a question that I believe to be of considerable importance. How long have you been the family solicitor for Mrs. Caldwell?" Whitmore's expression shifted slightly, becoming more guarded. "For some 30 years, Inspector. I drew up her husband's will, handled various legal matters, that sort of thing. And in all that time, have you ever been invited to enjoy one of her famous mince pies at her Christmas gathering?" The solicitor's face flushed deeply. "Well, that is to say, not precisely at the Christmas gathering. No, she has occasionally sent a pie or two to my office during the season, but you have never been invited to her home for the tea itself?" "No, Inspector, I have not." "But I fail to see what relevance the relevance, Mr. Whitmore, is that you have served as this woman's solicitor for 3 decades, managing her affairs, protecting her interests, and yet she has never invited you to this supposedly exclusive and important gathering. Tell me, how does that make you feel?" Mr. Whitmore's face deepened to a shade of purple that caused Inspector Graves momentary concern for the man's blood pressure. He opened his mouth several times without producing any coherent sound, his hands gripping the arms of his chair with such force that his knuckles went white. "How dare you?" he finally managed, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "How dare you suggest that I would harbour resentment toward Mrs. Caldwell for a matter of social protocol? I am a respected member of this community, Inspector. I do not require invitations to tea parties to validate my position. And yet," Graves continued calmly, "you were invited this year, were you not? For the first time in 30 years, you received an invitation to Mrs. Caldwell's exclusive Christmas gathering. That must have felt rather significant." Whitmore's flush receded slightly, replaced by an expression of confusion. "I?" "Yes, I was invited this year. I assumed it was merely an oversight on previous occasions, or perhaps she believed my wife would find the gathering tedious. I thought nothing of it. And how did you feel receiving that invitation?" "I felt honoured, if you must know. It seemed that perhaps my years of service had finally been acknowledged." The inspector made a careful note of this response. "Tell me, Mr. Whitmore, did you arrive at Thornfield Hall at the same time as the other guests, or did you arrive earlier?" The solicitor's eyes narrowed slightly. "I arrived early, as it happens. Mrs. Caldwell had asked me to review some documents related to a small amendment to her will. I came at 2 o'clock, an hour before the other guests were due to arrive. And in that hour, were you present when the mince pies were being arranged on the platters? I was in Mrs. Caldwell's study. Inspector. The arrangement of the pies took place in the drawing room. I would not have been present, but you would have had the opportunity to move between the study and the drawing room without being observed, would you not? Whitmore stood abruptly, his chair scraping backward with a harsh sound. Inspector, I will not sit here and be subjected to these implications. I did not poison anyone. I did not even know Mr. Pemberton particularly well. The man was a retired schoolmaster, hardly someone with whom a man in my position would naturally associate. Please sit down, Mr. Whitmore, Graves said quietly. I am not accusing you of anything. I am merely attempting to establish the facts. Your early arrival at Thornfield Hall is a matter of record, and I must question all with the opportunity to interfere with the pies. Whitmore remained standing for a moment longer, his breathing heavy, his face still flushed with anger. Then, slowly, he lowered himself back into the chair. I did not do it, he repeated, his voice now lacking conviction. Whatever you may think, whatever suspicions you may harbour, I did not poison those pies. After Whitmore had been dismissed, Inspector Graves sat in contemplative silence, reviewing his notes of the past 2 days' investigations. He had uncovered motives aplenty, resentment, anger, bitterness, exclusion, but he had not yet found definitive proof of guilt. The chemical analysis of the remaining pies had confirmed that one of them contained strychnine, a poison that would produce the exact symptoms that Mr. Pemberton had exhibited. But which pie? And more importantly, who had had both the means and the opportunity to poison it? He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he did not immediately notice when Miss Marple appeared at the study door, her small frame silhouetted against the hallway light. "Inspector," she said softly, "I wonder if I might trouble you for a few minutes of your time. I believe I have come to understand something of importance about this matter." Graves gestured for her to enter and to take her customary seat. Miss Marple settled herself with her usual careful deliberation before speaking. "I have been reflecting," she began, "on a curious fact that I observed during the tea party. Do you remember that I mentioned Mr. Pemberton seemed to take a second look at his mince pie before eating it?" "I do," the inspector confirmed. "You suggested that he seemed to notice something about it." "Precisely," Miss Marple said. "Now, what might a man notice about a mince pie that would cause him to pause before consuming it? It would not be the taste, for one cannot know the taste merely by looking. It would not be the appearance, for all of Mrs. Caldwell's pies are nearly identical, unless there was something about that particular pie that was different from the others." She paused, allowing this observation to settle. "I have been thinking about how the pies were distributed, Inspector. Mrs. Caldwell herself placed them on the guests' plates, did she not? And she began with me, the eldest guest. Then she moved around the room, serving others. Mr. Pemberton was served, I believe, quite late in the distribution, near the end, in fact." "Yes," Graves said slowly, beginning to perceive the direction of her thoughts. "Mrs. Caldwell served him near the end of the distribution, and in serving all the guests before him, she handled many pies, did she not? Her hands touched each one as she placed it on a plate. Now, suppose that she had poisoned one particular pie, the final one, or near to final, and suppose that Mr. Pemberton, in receiving this pie, happened to notice something amiss. A slight discoloration, perhaps, or a subtle change in the filling's appearance, something that caused him to hesitate before eating. Inspector Graves felt a sudden chill run through him. "Miss Marple, are you suggesting that Mrs. Caldwell poisoned Mr. Pemberton?" "I am suggesting, Inspector, that one should consider all possibilities, however uncomfortable they may be. Mrs. Caldwell is a woman of considerable pride, of exacting standards, of rigid control over her domain and her reputation. What might drive such a woman to commit murder? The inspector was silent for a long moment, turning this possibility over in his mind. It ran counter to everything he had assumed about the case. Yet there was a certain logic to it, a certain terrible coherence. "I shall need to question her again," he said finally. "But Miss Marple, if what you suggest is true, what was her motive? What could Mr. Pemberton have done to provoke such an extreme response?" Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved toward the study window, looking out into the darkening afternoon. "That, Inspector, is a question that only Mrs. Caldwell herself can answer. But I would suggest that you inquire about her knowledge of the allegations that were made against Mr. Pemberton all those years ago. And I would ask her whether she believed him to be guilty of what he was accused." Inspector Graves summoned Mrs. Caldwell to the study as the evening shadows began to lengthen across Thornfield Hall. She arrived with her customary composure, though he could detect a brittleness in her bearing that had not been present during their earlier conversations. She wore a dress of dark grey wool, appropriate for mourning, though she had not yet formally entered that state. Her silver hair was immaculately arranged, and her hands, when she folded them in her lap, were steady. "Mrs. Caldwell," the inspector began, his voice gentle but purposeful, "I should like to return to the subject of your knowledge regarding the allegations made against Mr. Pemberton some 15 years ago. I understand that your late husband was magistrate at the time and that he investigated the matter personally." Mrs. Caldwell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That is correct, Inspector. It was a regrettable incident, though it was resolved satisfactorily at the time." "Resolved satisfactorily," Graves repeated thoughtfully. The young woman recanted her accusations, and the matter was closed. "Yet I have been led to understand that your husband harbored doubts about the truth of that recantation, that he believed the girl had been pressured into withdrawing her allegations." For a long moment, Mrs. Caldwell did not respond. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My husband was a just man, Inspector, a fair man. He spent many years in the service of this community, attempting to ensure that truth prevailed and that the innocent were protected. The matter of Margaret Ashford troubled him greatly. He believed that she had been coerced into recanting her story, but he could find no evidence to support his suspicions. The girl herself refused to speak further on the subject. In the end, the law does not permit one to prosecute a man for a crime that has not been proven. He was forced to accept defeat, though it pained him deeply. "And you?" The inspector pressed gently. "What did you believe, Mrs. Caldwell?" She turned her gaze toward the window, where the last light of day was fading into twilight. "I believed my husband, Inspector. If he believed Mr. Pemberton to be guilty, then he was guilty. My husband did not make mistakes in matters of character. He was an excellent judge of men." Graves made careful notes of her response. "This belief, then, led you to harbour resentment toward Mr. Pemberton? To regard him as a man who had escaped justice for a heinous crime?" "It did," Mrs. Caldwell admitted, "though I confess that I never spoke of it openly. One does not accuse a respected member of the community without concrete evidence. But yes, I regarded him with contempt. Every time I saw him in the village, every time our social circles intersected, I was reminded of the injustice that had been done to that poor girl and of the law's inability to protect the innocent from predators." The inspector leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Caldwell, I must ask you a direct question, and I implore you to answer with complete honesty. Did you poison Mr. Pemberton?" Mrs. Caldwell's hands, which had remained steady throughout the conversation, suddenly began to tremble. She pressed them together, as though attempting to contain their shaking through sheer force of will. A long silence filled the study, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece and the faint sound of wind moving through the bare branches outside. "Yes," she said finally, her voice so quiet that Graves had to lean closer to hear her. "Yes, I poisoned him. I poisoned him because I could no longer bear the knowledge that he walked free in this village, that he was respected and honored, that no one but myself and my late husband knew the truth of his nature. I poisoned him because justice, which should have been swift and certain, never came." She looked up at the inspector, and her eyes were filled not with fear or remorse, but with a kind of grim determination. "I had the poison for many months, Inspector. Strychnine, purchased ostensibly for the purpose of eliminating rats from my garden. I kept it locked away, hidden in the back of my wardrobe, waiting for an opportunity that seemed appropriate." This Christmas gathering seemed to present the ideal circumstances. Everyone knew of my mince pies, everyone anticipated them. If something went wrong with them, if one person became ill, it would be a tragedy. But it would be an understandable accident. And if that person happened to be the man whom I had come to regard as the greatest injustice in my life, then perhaps there was a kind of cosmic balance in it. "Mrs. Caldwell," Graves said carefully, "you are aware that you are confessing to murder? That such a confession will result in your arrest and prosecution?" "I am aware, Inspector," she replied, "and I accept the consequences of my actions. I have lived a long life, and I have lived it with honor and integrity as best I was able. But I could not allow a man I believed to be a predator of children to continue walking about this community unpunished. The law failed to protect the innocent. I did what I felt was necessary." "How did you introduce the poison into the pie without being observed?" Graves asked, his investigator's instinct still requiring the completion of the practical details, even as his mind reeled at the confession. "It was quite simple, actually," Mrs. Caldwell explained. "I prepared the pies this morning, as I have done every year. The strychnine was in powder form, easily dissolved. When I was arranging the pies on the platters in the drawing room, a task I performed myself while the other guests were arriving, I had the poison in a small vial in my pocket. I introduced it into one particular pie, the one I intended to serve to Mr. Pemberton. I knew which one it was because I had marked the bottom of the plate with a tiny scratch that only I would recognize. When I distributed the pies, I ensured that this particular pie came to him. And you did not fear that someone else might eat the poisoned pie? That an innocent person might die instead of your intended victim?" "I took precautions to ensure that would not happen," Mrs. Caldwell said. "I served the guests in a particular order, keeping the poisoned pie aside until the very end. I ensured that Mr. Pemberton would be one of the last to be served. It was a calculated risk, certainly, but one that I felt was justified by the cause." Inspector Graves rose from his chair and moved toward the door where Sergeant Collins was waiting. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "please take Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell into custody. She is to be charged with the murder of Harold Pemberton." As Mrs. Caldwell stood to be led away, she turned back to the inspector with an expression of resigned acceptance. "I do not expect understanding, Inspector," she said. "Nor do I expect forgiveness. I have taken a life, and the law must have its due. I accept that. But I want you to know that I have made no apology for my actions, and I never shall. Some things are worth dying for." The drawing room had emptied rapidly once word of Mrs. Caldwell's arrest had spread through Thornfield Hall. The other guests, released from their forced confinement, had departed within the hour, their expressions a mixture of shock, relief, and the peculiar satisfaction that comes from being present at a momentous event. The vicar had lingered longest, attempting to speak with Mrs. Caldwell before she was taken away, but she had politely refused his ministrations, stating that she had nothing to confess to God that she had not already confessed to the law. By evening, the house had fallen into a heavy silence, broken only by the footsteps of police officers completing their final documentation and the occasional creak of the old building settling into the winter night. Inspector Graves remained in the study, reviewing his notes and attempting to reconcile the portrait of Mrs. Caldwell that had emerged over the course of his investigation with the woman who had confessed to murder. She had been, by all accounts, a woman of principle and propriety, a pillar of her community, a keeper of traditions and moral standards. Yet beneath that carefully constructed facade lay a woman consumed by a sense of injustice so profound that it had ultimately driven her to the most serious of crimes. It was Miss Marple who finally broke the silence of the house by appearing at the study door sometime after 9 o'clock in the evening. She carried with her a cup of tea, which she set on the desk before the inspector with a gesture of quiet concern. "You have had a long day, Inspector," she said gently, "and I suspect that you are troubled by what has occurred. It is a difficult thing, is it not, when one discovers that evil wears the face of respectability?" Graves accepted the tea gratefully and gestured for Miss Marple to sit. "I confess that I am troubled," he admitted. Mrs. Caldwell's confession answers the question of who committed the murder, but it raises far more troubling questions about justice, morality, and the proper functioning of the law. "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, settling herself into the chair with her customary deliberation. "And these are questions that do not have easy answers, Inspector. I have lived a very long time, and I have observed many things about human nature and the way that society functions. One of the things I have learned is that justice, as it is administered by law, is often imperfect and incomplete. Laws are made by men, and men are fallible creatures prone to error and to blindness." "Are you suggesting, Miss Marple, that Mrs. Caldwell was justified in taking the law into her own hands?" Graves asked, his tone careful but not accusatory. "I am suggesting nothing of the sort," Miss Marple replied calmly. "What Mrs. Caldwell did was murder, pure and simple. No matter how righteous her motivations may have seemed to her, she took a human life without legal authority. That is a crime, and it must be punished as such. The law exists precisely because we cannot allow individuals to determine their own justice. That path leads only to chaos and to the triumph of might over right." She paused, considering her words carefully. "However, I am also suggesting that we might reflect upon the fact that the tragedy of this situation was not merely the death of Mr. Pemberton, but the failure of the legal system to protect Margaret Ashford when she needed protection. Had that system functioned properly, had the truth been revealed and justice administered fairly, none of this would have occurred. Mrs. Caldwell's crime grew from the soil of an injustice that the law failed to rectify." Graves was silent for a long moment, contemplating Miss Marple's words. He thought of Margaret Ashford, now living in Surrey, her life forever altered by what had happened to her as a girl. He thought of Dr. Ashford, carrying the burden of his sister's pain and his own impotence in the face of it. He thought of Mrs. Caldwell, who had spent 15 years nurturing a hatred born from her belief in her husband's judgment. And he thought of Mr. Pemberton, dead at the hands of a woman who had believed him to be guilty of a crime that had never been proven. "What do you believe, Miss Marple?" he asked finally. "Do you believe that Mr. Pemberton was guilty of the charges that were made against him?" Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the window where the winter darkness pressed against the glass. "That is a question to which I do not have a definitive answer, Inspector. The evidence is old and incomplete. Margaret Ashford recanted her allegations, and we do not know whether she did so because they were false or because she was coerced into silence. Mr. Pemberton never admitted to any wrongdoing, but neither did he defend himself with particular vigour. He accepted the closure of the investigation and continued his life in the village as though nothing had occurred. Whether this was the behaviour of an innocent man grateful for his vindication, or the behaviour of a guilty man relieved to have escaped justice, that is something only he could have told us, and he is now beyond answering." "But you must have formed an opinion," Graves pressed. "After all, you guided me toward Mrs. Caldwell as the guilty party. Surely that guidance was based on some assessment of the underlying facts." Miss Marple smiled sadly. "I guided you toward Mrs. Caldwell, Inspector, not because I was certain of her guilt, but because I observed in her the kind of resentment and determination that could lead to such an action. I did not pretend to know whether Mr. Pemberton was guilty or innocent. I merely observed the patterns of human behavior and recognized in Mrs. Caldwell a woman who had convinced herself that justice required her intervention. Whether that belief was based on truth or on the distortions of her own mind, I cannot say with certainty." She rose from her chair and moved toward the door. The task of the investigator, inspector, is to discover what has occurred and who is responsible. You have accomplished that task admirably. The task of the judge and the jury will be to determine whether the guilty party shall be punished and to what extent. And the task of society will be to reflect upon how it came to be that such a tragedy could occur, and what might be done to prevent similar tragedies in the future. I suspect that all three of these tasks will prove to be far more complicated than the simple investigation of a crime. After Miss Marple had departed, Inspector Graves sat alone in the study, the weight of the case settling upon his shoulders like a physical thing. He had solved the murder, caught the guilty party, and seen her safely into custody. By the standards of his profession, he had done his job well. Yet he found himself haunted by the sense that there were deeper mysteries here that would never be fully resolved, questions about justice and morality that lay beyond the scope of any criminal investigation. The trial of Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell took place in the county courthouse some 3 months after the death of Harold Pemberton, by which time winter had given way to a tentative spring. The proceedings were attended by a considerable portion of Ashford-in-the-Waters population, all of whom came either out of genuine concern for the outcome or merely to witness the public spectacle of a respected woman brought low by her own actions. The prosecution's case was straightforward and compelling. Mrs. Caldwell had purchased strychnine months in advance, ostensibly for pest control, but in reality with murderous intent. She had poisoned one of her famous mince pies with methodical precision, carefully selecting which guest would consume the poisoned pastry. Mr. Pemberton had died in agony as a result of ingesting this poison, and Mrs. Caldwell had shown no remorse for her actions, having confessed freely to Inspector Graves. The defence, presented by a capable solicitor from the neighbouring market town, attempted to argue that Mrs. Caldwell's actions, while technically criminal, should be viewed with a degree of sympathy given her genuine belief that she was preventing future harm to children. This argument gained little traction with either the judge or the jury. The evidence was overwhelming, and Mrs. Caldwell herself had made no effort to deny her guilt or to minimize her responsibility. When called to testify, she presented herself with the same composure she had maintained throughout her interrogation, answering questions directly and honestly, never attempting to excuse or explain away her actions. She spoke briefly of her late husband's suspicions regarding Mr. Pemberton and of the pain that knowledge had caused her over the years, but she also acknowledged, when pressed by the prosecution, that she had no concrete evidence of Mr. Pemberton's guilt, only her husband's professional assessment and her own conviction that he must be guilty. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with a verdict of guilty on the charge of murder. Mrs. Caldwell accepted this verdict with visible equanimity, as though she had expected nothing less and regarded it as no more than the proper and inevitable consequence of her actions. When asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, she rose from the dock and addressed the court in a voice that was steady and clear. "Your Honour, I have nothing to add to what has already been said. I committed this crime deliberately and with full knowledge of its nature. I do not seek clemency or compassion. I acted according to my conscience, and I accept the judgment of the law. I would only ask that this case serve as a reminder to society that when the law fails to protect the innocent, vigilante justice, however well-intentioned, becomes inevitable." Perhaps if we examine how the original allegations against Mr. Pemberton were handled, we might find ways to prevent such situations from arising in the future. The judge sentenced her to life imprisonment, though given her advanced age, it was clear that this sentence would likely be served in a quiet prison hospital rather than in the harsh conditions of a regular cell. As she was led away, Mrs. Caldwell's gaze swept across the courtroom, and for a brief moment it came to rest on Miss Marple, who sat in the gallery with her hands folded quietly in her lap. The two women exchanged no words, no gestures of acknowledgement, yet something seemed to pass between them, a kind of mutual recognition that transcended the particular circumstances of the case. In the weeks and months that followed the trial, the village of Ashford-in-the-Water gradually returned to something approximating its normal routine. The scandal that had rocked the community slowly faded from the forefront of conversation, pushed aside by more immediate concerns and the natural human tendency to forget discomforting truths. Dr. Ashford remained in his position as village doctor, though his wife Patricia eventually left him and returned to London, unable to overcome the shadow that the case had cast over their marriage. The solicitor, Mr. Whitmore, continued to practice his profession, though he was never again invited to Mrs. Caldwell's Christmas gathering, an exclusion that no longer mattered given that the gathering itself had ceased to occur. The vicar delivered a series of sermons on the nature of justice and forgiveness, though few in the congregation took particular note of his message. Miss Marple returned to her cottage and her knitting, her involvement in the affair fading into the background as though it had been merely an episode in her long life rather than a defining moment in anyone else's. It was late on an April afternoon, nearly a year after the poisoning, that Inspector Graves encountered Miss Marple in the village post office. She was purchasing stamps with her usual methodical care, examining each one as though she had never seen a stamp before. Graves had come to the village to attend to some final details related to the case, and he greeted her with genuine warmth. "Miss Marple," he said, "I have often thought of our conversations during the investigation. I wonder if you might share your thoughts now that some time has passed. Do you believe that justice was truly served in this matter?" Miss Marple completed her transaction with the postmistress before turning to address the inspector. Justice, Inspector, is a concept that becomes more elusive the more carefully one examines it. Mrs. Caldwell has been imprisoned for a crime that she did not deny committing. In that sense, the law has been satisfied. But has justice been served? I am not entirely certain. We still do not know with absolute certainty whether Mr. Pemberton was guilty of the crime of which Mrs. Caldwell believed him to be guilty. We do not know what became of Margaret Ashford, or whether she eventually found peace with what happened to her. We do not know whether Mrs. Caldwell's imprisonment will prevent future vigilante actions, or whether it will instead inspire them. We know only that a woman whose life was governed by principle and propriety has ended that life in prison, and that the community she served has lost one of its anchors. She paused, adjusting her small parcel of stamps with careful precision. In my experience, Inspector, the resolution of a crime is rarely as satisfying as one might hope. We discover who committed the deed and why, and we ensure that the law takes its course. But the deeper questions, the questions about how such a situation came to be, and what might be done to prevent similar tragedies, these questions often remain unanswered. Perhaps that is as it must be. Perhaps the best we can do is to observe human nature carefully, to recognize the patterns of resentment and injustice that lead to such outcomes, and to use that knowledge to conduct ourselves with greater compassion and understanding toward those around us. As Miss Marple walked away down the village high street, her small figure growing gradually smaller in the distance, Inspector Graves reflected that he had never encountered an investigator quite like her. She had solved the case not through forensic evidence or brilliant deduction, but through her profound understanding of human psychology and her patient observation of the small details that revealed the depths of human motivation. In solving the murder of Harold Pemberton, she had illuminated truths about justice, morality, and the nature of evil that no courtroom verdict could fully address. The village of Ashford-in-the-Water had returned to its peaceful surface, but beneath that surface, the currents of human emotion and conflict continued to flow, waiting for the next moment when they would erupt into violence. And in her cottage, Miss Marple continued her knitting, her pale blue eyes watching and observing, ready to see what others could not see, and to understand what others preferred to leave ununderstood.